Between me and you, I think everyone's a little bit racist sometimes.
As I've searched through the discussions of critical race theory on places like the YouTubes, I noticed a whole lot of people who don't really know what CRT is or where it came from, but have some really strong opinions on it all the same. It's a little surprising to me there isn't a more comprehensive discussion available, so I thought I'd make one. I prefer empowerment and information over sweeping polemics and rambling assertions about what someone thinks critical race is based on the 3 words in its title. Instead, I'm going to give an overview of what CRT actually is, where it came from, its basic methodology, and then I'm going to demonstrate how a critical race analysis can be performed on a text in order to identify why it exists at all as a going concern in areas of scholarship, such as law, social science, philosophy. Some of this video may be a review for some, but I urge bearing it through to the end. You can then decide for yourself. One cannot discuss critical race theory in particular without pointing specifically to scholars such as law professor Derek Bell. Dr. Bell passed away in 2011, and by that point, he'd been the first tenured black professor at Harvard Law, resigned his position at the Justice Department rather than renounce his membership in the NAACP, and along with a few others such as Richard Delgado, Edward Said, Mari Matsuda, Patricia Williams, Fatima Manisi, developed and popularized CRT as we know it today. This is not to say that any of these people was the singular and exclusive inventor of what is now critical race theory. It also doesn't mean there weren't other authors, theorists, and philosophers whose ideas are similar to, or later contributed to, Zora Neale Hurston, W.E.B. Du Bois. This is something particularly minority authors and theorists have been discussing for a while. It wasn't a singular academic approach either. Said and Mernisi's approach was specifically focused on artistic and literary representations of Asia as a land of mystery and reinvention, and the politics and social ramifications of those tropes. His brand of CRT is now called Orientalism, but it was and is a critical examination of those stereotypes and their consequences. There was also William Peterson's 1966 article on Japanese Americans, which became part of the spine of the model minority critique. I won't go into either of those in detail here. It's sufficient to say that there were a lot of contributors. That said, Dr. Bell and those after 1970 were the first authors to specifically and pointedly use the vocabulary and methodology that we now draw from in what has become modern critical race. What's most noticeable about Dr. Bell's analysis was his approach. Take sentencing rulings in otherwise identical court cases and compare the qualities of the defendants. What he found was overwhelmingly in the case of black defendants, the sentences were hugely disproportionate to white defendants for the same crime. Handily, the US government has frequently and repeatedly agreed. Dr. Bell proved statistically, scientifically, legally, the darkness of one's skin is directly proportional to the sentence. Blackness was hidden in the stats. It was being erased. Because of approaches such as Dr. Bell's, those who've since further developed CRT have a built-in direct challenge to those who claim CRT creates racial categories or pits one group against another. It can't. All critical race theory did was identify the groups and how law became an instrument in the process rather than some colorblind neutral party. There's no such thing as CRT inventing race. It identifies parts of society where race gets created and then maintained. A critical race theorist would use precisely the same methodology in China and be able to find whole swaths of people, all Chinese, who are all treated as inferior to other Chinese based on arbitrary physiological characteristics internal to China. And if you don't believe me on that, ask the Uyghurs if racism is a thing. This is also where CRT frequently gets spun to say that it's an attack on a particular group. CRT can't specifically attack a group. All it says is racism exists and has a measurable effect. The results of CRT have been several things. One element is what's called counternarrative, where the groups being erased are empowered to give their own account of lived experience. This is why appropriation is a conversation, or even movements like decolonization, where indigenous populations challenge prevailing ideas and authorities crafted by outsiders. In other cases, such as historiography, it has resulted in historical revisitation of known works where previous analysis is reconsidered for the biases of its author. My video on the Iroquoian underpinnings of several European anarchist and communist authors, and by the way a few critical theorists too, is an exercise in post-structural critical analysis. Another result has been examining how institutes perpetuate the process of racialization. Said talked about literature and history. Dr. Bell covered law. There's also medicine, technology. It means whole nations, like the US, have a fundamental underpinning of bigotry. It's not a speculative claim, it's a demonstrable statistical reality. The fact that the US Constitution said all men are created equal, while simultaneously asserting slaves are to be counted as 3/5 of a person, and was being written by slave owners, is a post-structural critical critical analysis of the Founding Fathers. Modern conservatives and right-wingers changing the subject to what the framers meant isn't contradicting critical race theory, it's validating it. The enactment of law is almost never neutral. By the way, there are also massive gaps in critical race theory which are being corrected by some theorists, but aren't automatically a part of CRT itself. A raw critical race analysis of the legal system would have almost no idea that disabilities exist. The intersections of various minority statuses, now called intersectional analysis, is hugely important, but it's in addition to the underlying theory. There are derivations of critical theory that include tribal critical theory, Pacific critical theory, the previously mentioned Orientalism. Really, if there's a racial or ethnic category, and that category is being erased, CRT works just the same. It even worked for Irish scholars trying to prove Irish slavery. Don't start furiously typing. The Irish were never the victims of the chattel slave trade of other peoples. What is true is at one point they were listed as one of the mongrel races, and Cromwell did forcibly move them from Ireland and deposit them in the Caribbean, like some other minorities we know. It doesn't excuse people trying to claim false equivalences on Reddit, and it definitely doesn't excuse the Irish themselves trying to get out of poverty by becoming slave traders. But as I said, CRT itself doesn't actually care. If anything, it further demonstrates race is a moving target. Whiteness itself doesn't exist because they keep adding and removing the types who qualify. If you personally want to devise a scale by which one group suffered more than another, you can certainly try, but any good critical theorist will also question how you plan to do that yourself without creating an arbitrary racial category for comparison and forcing people together who might feel they have nothing in common if you asked. One of the other scholars I listed, Richard Delgado, made almost exactly that same point in his text, For Reservations on Civil Rights Reasoning by Analogy. In that paper, he notes natives themselves were not included in legal cases resulting from the 13th and 14th Amendments and required their own separate legal protection, which wasn't enacted until the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924. That's 3/4 of a century after blacks. Quoting Delgado from that essay, it begins by noting how two critical race theory tenets, racial realism and interest convergence, counsel skepticism regarding new legislative remedies for minorities, particularly during conservative times. Racial profiling of Muslims, oppressive local ordinances criminalizing most of the conditions of life for undocumented immigrants, indefinite detention of suspected terrorists without a trial, and a host of practices denying gay and lesbian individuals the same rights as heterosexuals, all would seem prime candidates for condemnation under the 13th Amendment, since treatment of individuals in these groups can be characterized as degrading, dehumanizing, and pervasive. Yet no condemnation of any of these practices has come to pass. Bell, if he were still alive today, might say that this is not because of doubt over how oppressive and degrading these conditions are, but rather because each of these conditions is a favorite child of some empowered group, such as the intelligence establishment. In short, racism is permanent because even when two groups are being treated the same way, a third group will always say, it's different this time because. Delgado also notes, drawing analogies to black suffrage almost never works socially either. Just try to suggest that the 13th Amendment includes gay liberation on Twitter sometime. See how well that goes. Legally, it doesn't list any particular ethnicity or minority, but here we are. Even gay blacks have openly stated the two are related, and it was a no-go. Bayard Rustin, for example, and he organized the original March on Washington with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., he would certainly seem to qualify as a credible source. Which gets to the heart of what Dr. Bell and others were arguing in the first place. No matter what, keeping power in check is how we best survive, and despotic leadership will always try to divide and conquer. But it's because the leaders are speaking out of self-interest. It's not about being colorblind, it's about being unified by our endless varieties and accepting that conflict between groups is not merely inevitable, it's necessary. Otherwise, someone is being shut out. This is also why the frequent reply to critical race theory being, it just finds racism everywhere it looks, is firstly really boring, but second, it's a category error. Of course CRT finds racism everywhere it looks. The hint is in the name. Physicists find physics everywhere they look. Neil deGrasse Tyson ruining every single movie that has stars in it may be annoying, but it doesn't make him wrong. He's focusing on a particular detail within the way that the story's being told. CRT doesn't really care about situations where human racial categories couldn't possibly be a factor. There is no critical race analysis of how bigoted protons and neutrons are for not letting electrons join their nucleus club. Of course, CRT finds racism everywhere it looks. It's looking at systems where racists live. As a result, the very concept has become part of most scholarly discourse, and really without much objection. Drs. Bell and Said first published in the 70s. How It Feels to Be Colored Me by Hurston was published in 1928. Du Bois's The Souls of Black Folk in 1903. Boas's critique of scientific racism revisionism, such as the Social Organization and the Secret Societies of the Kwakiutl Indians, came out in 1897. Lucy Parsons' speech on black anarchism was printed in the Kansas City Journal in 1886, and Paiute Sarah Winnemucca's Life Among the Paiutes, Their Wrongs and Claims was published in 1883. Hey, you know all those Fox pundits whining about how critical race theory is just oversensitive academics on Reddit? Jordan Peterson is 135 years out of date. Stick that in your Chaos Dragon and smoke it. In fact, depending on which recorded version you go by, Sojourner Truth's Ain't I a Woman speech to the Seneca Falls Convention contained elements of critical race theory. Her argument was, after listening to a bunch of middle-class white ladies complain about how insulted they were at constantly having doors open for them, being black had meant she'd never had a door held open for her in her life, which would mean by their definition of womanhood, she wasn't a woman. Her speech was the basis for Bell Hooks' 1981 book by the same name, where Hooks discusses the conflicting difference between white feminism and non-white feminism. The Seneca Falls Convention was in 1848. So I was wrong. Jordan Peterson is 170 years out of date. Dude, read a book. Or how about this? YouTuber Adam Neely, talking about musicology, manages to never use the words critical or race and still gives the best possible justification for CRT in his video, The Worst Jazz Solo of All Time.
That there's not a lot of melody and there's not a lot of harmony.
Musica ricercata
Only fulfills one of these, the rhythm section.
Gotta pack it in, man. You're not a composer. Facts don't care about your feelings. So it's not really that useful to critique or analyze a piece of music solely based on cataloging the techniques used. That's not really enough to give you a full understanding of what's going on. Music theory without some kind of cultural or historical context just won't cut it.
It was practically a throwaway line, like he was just saying what we all already know. Side note, this guy knows his stuff, and his video, The Girl from Ipanema is a far weirder song than you thought, is a fantastic breakdown of how racism had a measurable role in the development of Brazilian samba and bossa nova, and US jazz. Yet not a single comment about how he's blaming all white people for the downfall of civilization. Ever hear someone talk about forced diversity? Like this guy, who I chose completely at random. I wonder if he's for or against. Let's find out.
But in most areas of life, I feel like if you're really good, you get ahead. And if you don't, that's the problem. The problem is racism. Mm-hmm. The problem is someone trying to stop you from getting ahead just because you are whatever you are.
Or
you're
sexism.
Black or white or sexism.
Yeah.
Yes, that's the real problem. The response to that is not forced diversity. The response to that is like racism is awful, and we should all agree. But it's not that you should force diversity.
I agree. Like, I think it's strange.
You make a mistake. You're making a mistake.
Yeah, and it's weird and kind of wrong and kind of gross.
With comedy.
Yeah, of course.
Catch it? That's a critical race analysis. Who is the audience? What racial assumptions and expectations do they have? Will the race of the performer conflict with the social expectations of the audience? What marginalized populations are being normalized by their lived presence in the performance? CRT is so uncontroversial, even people who think they're arguing against it are using it. This forced diversity nonsense goes all the way back to Shakespeare's time. So much so the play Othello, a play about a black man, was regularly attacked for even hinting the character might have dark skin. Some just decided the character wasn't supposed to be black at all. To be sure, it was most frequently played by a white guy in blackface anyway, but theatrical critics have been constantly complaining at being forced to see a black man on stage since shortly after the Bard's ink dried. They really didn't appreciate being forced to deal with a character on stage they would never encounter in their daily lives. On the other hand, CRT in the popular mind has become entwined with some fairly strange assertions, the conflation of racism and fascism, for example. CRT regularly proves the opposite is true. Racism is an almost universal element of all societies, which is why we have to keep an eye out for it. Dr. Bell himself regularly asserted democracy can be exactly as cruel to its minorities as any other form of government. Another pop CRT trope is privilege checks as a get out of any bullshit argument you happen to make because of being pissed at someone card. Dr. Bell never once claimed that no black man has ever performed a criminal act. He said they got punished more harshly. Me checking my privilege does not magically make what I said wrong. Ask a disability advocate or a trans man sometime about some rando on Twitter telling them to check their privilege because of their assumptions made about arbitrary characteristics related to spelling or access.
And none of this even has to do with the conclusions that scholars make based on critical race theory. This is just resistance to the way that they view the question itself. The answers tend to involve shit that they hate even more, like affirmative action, police reform, or just Like not using the N-word. They like to use the N-word, and they very much don't like it when they cannot use the N-word. That maybe if some people have all of the shit, and they have it for unfair reasons, we ought to take some of their shit and give it to people who have less shit for those same unfair reasons. That maybe if some people got rich off of other people being oppressed, that the oppressed people should at least be entitled to some of the proceeds.
Affirmative action isn't actually a CRT ideal either, or direct redistribution, frankly. Many, including Dr. Bell, were extremely critical of its efficacy and intent. After all, it's empowering those already in power, who are already behaving in a race-selective way, to continue discriminating, but doing so while bragging how this time it's the good kind of discrimination. The concept of reverse discrimination isn't an invention of conservative talk radio. It was the conclusion of the Supreme Court in the 1978 case Regents of the University of California versus Bakke, a real-life demonstration of CRT's premise. The final ruling being, if every minority already enumerated by previous law had been accounted for, racist hiring had been corrected, and it was now unfairly excluding whites, which violated equal protection. The Supreme Court made, we can't be racist, we have a student who's Mexican, into a law. Who's in power? What narratives do they craft to perpetuate that power? What ethnic minorities are excluded in that narrative? In fact, between the years of 1971 and 1991, when affirmative action was in full force, the income gap between whites and black families actually widened, meaning while the court was arguing whites were getting harmed, they were doing better than ever. Affirmative action was a bad idea that became a worse policy and as a result became terrible law. The point here is simply slapping critical race theory onto an idea does not imbue it with validity, like this little chestnut that gets way more credit than it deserves. Critical theory approaching this equation for the first time would find a significant number of flaws. None of the terms are qualified. What sort of prejudice? What sort of power? It is somewhat clarified when using Patricia Biddle-Padva's original use of the phrase in her 1972 educational handbook, Developing New Perspectives on Race, an Innovative Multimedia Social Studies Curriculum in Race Awareness for the Secondary Level. Quite a mouthful, which is because it was never really designed for public at large. It was meant as a teacher's training manual. It was only 50 pages long, and it's so obscure WorldCat doesn't even have a graphic for it. The reason it got any attention at all was it was picked up by Joseph Barnt for his 91 text Dismantling Racism. Since Biddle-Padva had degrees in organizational and educational psychology, her original definition contextualized her argument, but in a very particular way. What she proposed was prejudice in addition to institutional power. It was a way of understanding the dynamics of a system where authority is already established. The church, the courts, the family. When people try to deploy this equation on Twitter at a specific person, there are two conflicting types of racism at play. One type is individual on a one-to-one basis. The one the equation is actually discussing is huge social complexes. Instead, most people look at it and say, well, my people have no power, therefore I can't be racist. And we're off. And they dissolve into a shouting match over who's more marginalized as a group and therefore empowered to speak as an individual. A black judge who regularly overpunishes white defendants is doing a racism. Any institutional power plus prejudice equals racism. Judge is the key word. The very concepts of blue lives and ACAB depends on a black police officer being capable of allowing their badge to override their individual character. This is also nothing new. It's so commonly understood, it's literally a running joke in black sitcoms. YouTuber Renegade Cut made precisely that point in his video, 90s Black Sitcoms Warned Us. He noticed, even when black officers are depicted as having an overt dispute with their fellow police officers, the nod is toward the uniform, not the skin. And by far, Renegade is not the only one who's noticed how selectively a lot of people are choosing to interpret the word racism on Facebook. T1J has several videos on it, including Black People Can't Be Racist and the evidence of anti-black police bias with sources. Or we can just look at this photo for a minute. The badge wins. Interminority racism can also go in some seriously wacky directions. This was a post from rapper Ice Cube back in June of 2020. For most people, simply looking at it as a standalone tweet, it's kind of funny, especially since the Ethiopian statue has in the shot the plaque saying that it was a gift from Mexico and not an original work. But there's something significantly more insidious here. Notice the watermark on the photos? It's a little blurry, but that's the logo of the Nagus Network. It's a reference to a loose affiliation of historical revisionists who assert that all the major historical figures, including including Jesus, Buddha, and all of the historical cultures of Central America, were founded by Africans. A core tenet of their argument is some Africans and the carved heads of the Olmec look alike, therefore they must be related. A method of racial classification called phenotyping, which was invented by European phrenologists to categorize the races by their skulls. Designed by white Europeans to demonstrate their superiority, appropriated by Pan-African nationalists to assert all other cultures on Earth are a lie. In one fell swoop, Hoteps erased tens of thousands of years of history and culture on 3 continents. Just in case it seems I'm exaggerating, here's one of the videos they posted to their Facebook page. They also really hate vaccines and cow's milk, which is really odd given the number of cow-based pastoral tribes in Africa, but everybody has their thing. This is also part of an older myth created by early European ethnologists who tried to rectify natives and the Christian Bible by claiming natives were simply the lost tribe of Israel. The theory, if we can call it that, originates from several passages in the Bible, including Isaiah chapter 11, and gather together the dispersed of Judea from the 4 corners of the earth, and Matthew chapter 15, I was not sent except to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, which handily made natives Jews and insisted that we be converted to Christianity. Barnt even somewhat ties together this line of thinking by including in his book on racism the story of the Israelites rising up against the Pharaoh as a corollary for how minorities should rise up against white leadership in the modern church. It's a pretty pervasive trope. Although the Mormons had their own version, where brown skin was a punishment from God for decadence, but handily Jesus popped by on his way to heaven and baptized a few natives, the Hoteps get around this part of the story by saying natives as they exist today went to war with the Africans, and so the natives in the Americas today are actually fakes. They simply switched out white for black while leaving everything else exactly the same, which is why so much of their iconography is Egyptian. Egypt is mentioned in the Bible.
Hey everyone, this is Damon from Very Smart Brothers, and you're about to hear the only Hotep explainer you will ever need to hear. If someone has some lotion nearby, please help me out because it's about to get real ashy. Instead of toppling white supremacy, what Hoteps ultimately want to do is replace white male patriarchy with black male patriarchy.
Hey! Hey, Shawty with the locks. I see you, Nubian queen.
Actually, the Nubians are from the Sudan-Egypt region of Africa, and statistically speaking, most black people here are from the western region, which would make her a Yoruba queen, or maybe an Igbo queen.
Honestly, I don't think I'm really a queen. I think I'd be more interested in merchanting, textiles, maybe.
Jester, myself.
Alright, never mind. Dang.
Fun fact, the first documented African in what Europeans called the New World was not enslaved.
I'm intrigued.
But he was a conquistador.
I'm disappointed.
The claim that minorities cannot be racist, even against their own members, is not intrinsic to critical race theory. It is a product of CRT as performed by specific researchers with a very particular agenda. All CRT cares about is who is in power, who is not in power, and what underlying assumptions and narratives reinforce those dynamics. Returning to our equation, does it refer to any form of prejudice or a particular type of prejudice? I hate lemons. I hate them. They're awful, disgusting fruits, and they should never be where respectable fruits are. See, when I was 3, I saw a lemon, but I thought it was an orange, and I bit into it, and on top of being sour and terrible, it was rotten, and I've never gotten over it. And that is why I hate all lemons and lemon-based products. Which is why I called the police on that little Mexican girl, or whatever she is, down the street yesterday, Your Honor. Okay. The fact that I was taken seriously by the cop who showed up and arrested the 10-year-old brown girl means either they share my exact prejudice against lemons and lemon-based products, or then maybe the lemonade isn't the important detail of this story, which is when the equation goes completely off the rails. If institutional racism is the product of institutional prejudices enacted and maintained by institutional power, literally no one is responsible for racist behaviors. It's all just autopilot. Or of institutional power when combined with individual prejudice prejudices, then any act of an individual which might be based on racial prejudices, but where the individual has no power, is not actually racist. It's someone being mean in a way that if we had power, we could call it racist, but they don't, so we can't. Before I get too deep into the semantic and semiotic weeds here, the point is this definition has a particular target: secondary level school children. It's not meant as an accurate reflection of the complexities and nuances of deep social theory. It's a bird's eye view of racialization as explained to a room of 15-year-olds, not a complete rewrite of the fundamental nature of all forms of bigotry. At this point, it's useful to introduce how a lot of the vocab that led to critical race theory really got going. A history which would be hard to do without at least giving a basic discussion of the European critical theorists.
Just sit down and listen. First of all, is everyone who lives in this house here at this very moment?
Yes.
Then for the last time, picture it. Sicily, 1922.
Sorry, no. Goethe University, Frankfurt. But still 1922-ish, actually. A group of instructors and academics are watching the Weimar Republic slowly disintegrate and the various Russian revolutions dissolve into chaos or despotism, as noted with extreme bitterness by the likes of Alexander Berkman. And they say to themselves, they said, maybe this whole Marxist-Leninist versus capitalist world as we know it thing isn't working out. Maybe we should agree to see as a people. Maybe it's not them. Maybe it's us. Boom! Critical theory was born. With a bizarre and heady mixture of Freudian introspection, throwback Marxist economic analysis, Weberian and Simmelian social science, a sliver of what would eventually come to be known as existentialism, and just a hint of rosemary for flavor, let marinate for 20 to 25 years, and this loose affiliation of otherwise fairly disconnected scholars created a self-reflective system for looking at one's own culture and assumptions and questioning whether they were based on beliefs, ideals, or statistical realities, because these are not the same thing. To be clear, these guys were not what one might now consider particular revolutionaries. Adorno hated jazz music with a passion and direct action, so much so he wouldn't even take questions when appearing in person, and it got to the point a group of women started protesting him in the 1960s by appearing at his lectures naked, causing him to dart out of the room while shielding himself with his briefcase, but still not taking questions. Horkheimer argued literally every event of mass media is a treatise on the desert of the mind, and people only go to movies to escape reality in a form of collective denialism, which he likened to hallucinatory wish fulfillment, and one wonders what he would say about the fact that the Communist Manifesto had so many sales. Yeah, Compritis and Guess, themselves later critical theorists, said Habermas treated social change as more of an aesthetic than a social event, meaning liberation is an entire mental exercise, so all forms of violence are equal and therefore equally wrong. They were definitely a mismatched bunch for anyone trying to paint early critical theory as some sort of rage against the machine. As good an example as any is in Dialectic of Enlightenment, Adorno and Horkheimer heap particular scorn on people who are into BDSM, to the point that they literally compare the European Enlightenment to the Marquis de Sade's text Juliet, a book about an amoral nymphomaniac, just because they seem to not like being sex positive. And yeah, I know, some dear listeners are extra special irritated with me right now at how dare I not go into a long-winded recitation of chapters 2 through 5 of Communication and the Evolution of Society. But you know what? These guys between them wrote over 50 books that spanned 4 decades, and in many ways, they were retreading ground a bunch of minorities in other places had already covered. I am definitely, absolutely, without question, leaving out some detail. Unfortunately for all of us, I don't have a spare throat in my purse, and nobody needs a 5-hour deep dive on Herbert Marcuse's takedown of Soviet Marxism. They did manage one thing, though, with their strange concoction of in many ways directly contradictory philosophers and previous theorists. They proved, without doubt, modernism wasn't all that it bragged to be. See, modernism was an aesthetic and philosophical movement that loved the heck out of technology. Look, kids, plastic, clean lines, industry. Then World War I happened, and all those brilliant mechanical devices were turned into devastating machines of death, and all those fancy new communication devices like Bakelite radios were turned to propaganda dispensers, and academics like the Frankfurt School said, maybe unbridled progress isn't always great. If I were to summarize the entirety of the Frankfurt School in a single phrase, it would be that absurdly famous scene from Jurassic Park.
We're so preoccupied with whether or not they could, they didn't stop to think if they should.
So they tried to figure out where it all went wrong. They came up with very few good answers, and even fewer methods for not screwing up again. Still, they managed to get some people's attention. Postmodernism became a going concern. That is the absurdly brief history of critical theory. A bunch of guys in Germany and a few other places saying, hey, did you notice notice a lot of things suck right now, even after a century of people's revolutions and overthrowing monarchies? I wonder how that happened. They started picking apart linguistic bias, legal systems. They really left no stone unturned. All in all, they were a big-ish deal, but not in the way most people who've never read any of them think. It wasn't specifically for what they themselves said, but for the basic fact they were willing to question the assumptions of literally any system put in front of them, and make noise about it. This is why the prefix critical is put on theories and methods that pick apart social systems. A statistical analysis of divorce rates is simply a statistical analysis. A critical analysis of divorce is asking what the participants meant by the word divorce. Today, the very idea researchers wouldn't account for those sorts of considerations is almost laughable, but at the time there were all kinds of studies floating around that didn't even treat such details as relevant. That is how we get to modern critical theories, such as critical race theory, critical feminist theory, queer theory. All of those methods examine the underlying assumptions of the data they're identifying. Once the Europeans were firmly on board, the vocabulary was finally mostly unified, and the researchers never looked back. Well, as I said at the outset, for some of this, it will be an almost boring review of concepts that you're already familiar with. I ask your indulgence. Starting out with basic premises. When what is now called zoology and anthropology was first getting off the ground, it was mostly definitions of species. Frankly, there were entire religions that centered around chronicling all of creation. The encyclopedians, for example, monks and scholars who tried to develop compendiums of all human knowledge. Considering they didn't even know the Americas existed when this whole prospect got off the ground, it was a pretty misleading statement, but why quibble? Carlos Linnaeus was a big name in this mess. He came later, around the 1700s, but he liked the idea of indexing all of reality, so he fits right in. He's mostly famous now for developing a naming scheme for categorizing all life on Earth, and since the scanning tunning electron microscope hadn't been invented yet, he went with what he knew, namely their shape. Like this guy. Its common name is Virginia creeper. Nice and explanatory. But its Linnaean name? Hedera quinquifolia. Literally, it translates to 5-leaf ivy, not to be confused with all the other ivy with 5 leaves. Never mind. It was a system, and it was consistent, and it even worked on people. Homo habilis, toolmaker. That's it. She gets one hobby to distract herself from the kids, and suddenly it becomes the name of her entire species. It meant that people started hunting around for every possible scenario they could find where adaptation and physical change had been caused by some sort of physical truth, so that they could name what that was and write it down in their adorable little books. A good focal point for this would be Darwin. The guy put out an idea that one of the reasons creatures change over time is because something in their environment has shifted. Well, great. Except change from what to what? Gonna need a progression chart, see? In fact, Darwin wasn't even the first one to tie physical attributes to environment and behavioral factors. A French guy named Lamarck had done it 50 years earlier and called it theory of inheritance of acquired characteristics. Of course, Lamarck said giraffes had long necks because their parents had stretched their necks to get to higher fruit, whereas Wallace and Darwin said that the reason giraffes had long necks was because the short-necked ones all starved. The thing is, both of them said your parents' environment shaped you, which is why when Darwin first proposed his own theory of natural selection at the Royal Society in 1859, the Society's secretary recorded it as a modification to Lamarck's premise, not as some groundbreaking brilliance that single-handedly revolutionized all of human thought. Cow breeders had been doing it for centuries by that point. Which is also one of the reasons that I have on this chart a racial categorization right next to dog breeds, because it illustrates the gigantic flaw in the word race. When it came to biologists like Lamarck and Darwin talking about ancestry and adaptation, they literally treated it like it was the same thing. Today, when we use the term species in a modern context, what we mean is any animal which can breed with any other animal and produce viable offspring. A Great Dane can have a puppy with a Chihuahua. The physics involved aren't really the issue. On the other hand, a turkey cannot have viable offspring with an ostrich, even though they are physiologically similar. The thing is, though, they were having to differentiate between physical characteristics even within a species. Otherwise, Linnaeus' system totally falls apart. That's where the idea of phenotyping comes in. Phenotyping is paying attention to physiological characteristics that exist within a species so that any given species can have several, even dozens of different phenotypes. Ever heard the term recessive trait? Like how red hair is a recessive trait? Or Gregor Mendel and his Punnett squares? That's a phenotype, not a genetic code. If anything, it proves phenotypes can lie about someone's genetic code. That white flower, it looks nothing like its mom, yet they're directly related, which apparently people need to be reminded about every few months. The problem with some of the early biological anthropology was they mostly had no clue what they were talking about. Here is a fantastic example. Guess where we get the designation Caucasian? The term was invented by an anatomist named Blumenbach, who fell in love with a skull, and decided, since the skull most closely resembled the skulls of people from the Caucasus Mountains region of Eastern Europe and Western Asia, that must mean Caucasians are the most beautiful breed of human. People from the Caucasus tend to have lighter skin, so therefore the good European breeds must have descended from the Caucasians. Therefore, white people in Western Europe are the most beautiful because a dude got a crush on a skull. You have no idea how much I wish I was making any of that up. Start getting into the texts these guys were writing, and early anthropology swiftly becomes a nightmare tangle of Enlightenment incels rambling about femurs and hair color. Don't get me wrong, the Caucasus Mountains are fantastic, and the people are just as attractive as any other people on Earth. However, though many of my professional colleagues are odd, none of them has ever divulged a desire to bang a skeleton. A lot of us have pushed back on the whole skull typing thing, except for a couple of details. For example, skulls from cultures who have refined agriculture have lost most of their dentition because of the processed sugars destroying their enamel. Brush your teeth, kids. The truly bizarre thing was, even with all this skull obsession, Blumenbach himself said there was no intellectual difference between people, and he had a surprisingly diverse collection of African literature for the period, but entirely unsurprisingly, that's not the part of his theory that others fixated on. This is why modern zoologists, biological anthropologists, taxonomists, Ernst Mayr is a strong name to insert here, but it's been several others. While we're still talking about race and species, we're actually much more interested in what are called clades and terminal taxon. I know, jargon ahoy, but it's really quite simple. A clade is a group of creatures that all share a common ancestor. A terminal taxon is the last of the line that we know about. In other words, humans, chimps, gorillas, we share a clade, but humans can only make other humans. Great apes are part of a clade, humans are a species. A Great Dane can make something other than a Great Dane. It is not a terminal taxon. Biologically, Great Danes are nothing but a shape, a collection of selectively bred phenotypes, which doesn't mean much of anything. By the way, notice the little trick Blumenbach pulled with his Caucasian skull back there? He compared the skull to other skulls, but their skins to other skins. It's almost like he had no clue how biology works and was just making it up as he went, which is why discussions of race and racism and how we study those issues needed additional context, because there's never been a neutral party involved. That's the heart of racialization. Racialization is where critical race theory lives. It's when we create these arbitrary categories various people are slotted into based on any number of physical characteristics, and then those assumed identities are reaffirmed by different social institutions. Depending on the time period and the creepy dudes involved, race can mean species, phenotype, some combination, or sometimes something else entirely. We might as well be talking about urine typing and the Four Noble Humors. They played the race card there too, because of course they did. It's not a biological fact or a consistent cultural category. Race can almost never tell of any of the issues most people mean when they say it. Instead, academically, we started to shift toward ethnicity, what language they speak, what sort of food they prefer to eat. That information is useful. It can give us whole swaths of data on migratory patterns, along with some sense of their own personal identity. A great example of utilizing this method is cultural cookbooks, like this one, Jewish Cooking in America. Food traditions can be incredibly informative. It's also why we can quite easily say that anti-Muslim bias is a form of racism in social science, and we don't get confused. Some armchair debate bro on Reddit may be thrilled to whittle biddles to fling that dictionary as hard as he possibly can, thud, right there on the metaphorical table, and declare with all the grandiosity of a Spaniard announcing they've found El Dorado, "Religions aren't races, it says so right here in Merriam-Webster. I am amazingly smart, bow before my hair-splitting might!" And everyone who actually knows what they're talking about immediately says, "Oh goody, a prick," and walks away. Because we know that's not how words work. Racism is believing a series of arbitrary characteristics are somehow informative, and when every picture in the popular press of a Muslim looks like Osama bin Laden's more conservative kid sister, that's made Muslims into a race. Ta-da! It's magic. There are certainly other considerations as well. Class can sometimes, well, in fact, frequently is tied to ethnicity and ethnic identity, but it's a separate subject. Class is not on its own an indication of ethnic category. It isn't on its own an indication of a particular location or a particular food source. Notice, all the people in this picture look exactly the same. Some people can be from a variety of different ethnicities and still inhabit the same class. Sometimes, depending on the location, one particular ethnicity is exclusive to a particular class. It's a useful category all its own. At best, when combined with race, it helps in understanding how ethnicities interact with institutions. I've already mentioned social institutions, but it's worth fleshing out a bit here. Who society as a whole calls your mom and dad is entirely outside of your control and was decided long before any of us were born. The way to tell that is you didn't invent the language you speak. For example, there is no such thing as the race Hispanic or Latinx in any biological or cultural sense. Hispanic covers virtually any location, from Mexico to various parts of the Caribbean to whole sections of South America and over to Spain, sometimes even the Philippines. Someone can be born, live, and die in Mexico or born, live, and die in Portugal, speak a completely different language between those two, never meet someone who's from Brazil or from Mexico, and still be considered Hispanic. Latinx is no more precise, but oddly it does factor out Spain, Suriname, Guyana, and French Guyana, although Venezuela and Brazil is still included. So Guyanese, congrats. They're from South America, but not Hispanic or Latino unless dad's from Venezuela, so they get to be Latinx and Hispanic, but go to visit their cousin in Brazil, she's Latinx but not Hispanic. Handily though, everyone's from Latin America, and this all makes perfect sense because reasons, pleb. Or be from none of those locations and somehow still know what Hispanic is describing. Like there's a place called Hispanitinia. It doesn't tell us where they're from, it doesn't tell us whether they speak Portuguese or Spanish or French or any of the various creoles and indigenous languages, and it definitely doesn't prove that the people from there have any sense of shared identity.
Well, I had to go make a video like this because certain people like this not very educated. So this person said make I stay in my place because I am not Jamaican. I know I am not Jamaican. If you watch the video where people they comment make I stop Jamaican, if uno would I click in my picture and go in my page, uno would I clearly say my bio say Belizean. Second of all, I know they speak no patois or patois or whatever. I they speak Belizean Creole, and if uno go Google or ask, it would clearly say what it related to, and one of the options is Jamaican patois. They're not the same race, but it sound close to it. So if you don't know me, please hop off of my page before you go comment some race like you know me. Thank you.
Hispanic is a term that has no definitive meaning, and yet it exists as a legal category. Don't even get me started on Asian and Pacific Islander. That is racialization. A race of people created out of thin air, and we all agreed to it, and now it's in the dictionary. That also brings up the academic definition of deviance. Deviance is tied to social capital, how much credibility one has in a group. Those who are deviant have less social capital than those who aren't, and it affects their social access and social mobility as a result. It's also why we say people of color, because everyone is judged relative to whiteness. Racialization of deviance is where we get a lot of common phrases in critical theory, such as commodification of color, abolishing whiteness. Probably the easiest of these is commodification of color. It's simply recognizing when a specific group is ostracized from the norm, certain parts of it will become fetishized, and that allows normal people to borrow from the minority to set themselves apart, providing social capital. Ever see some douche bro at a music festival wearing a feathered headdress? In a sea of other white faces, they've set themselves apart. They've used non-majority elements to sell themselves socially. We find this most often in areas of social movement, like tourism, where posters and brochures will talk about the seductive Orient or the tropical glow, and then they'll show some woman dressed like a geisha or a muscle brown man swaying his hips. That's race tourism. Ever hear someone say they wanted to travel and see the world because they want to experience other cultures? That's race tourism. Maasai tribesmen have cell phones. Call one. It's also literally making money, clout, and self-exploration off of non-white bodies and histories, making them foreign and their non-normalness into an intellectual and often financial commodity. Whether the locals choose to turn it back on the tourists and make money from their conceit isn't really the question. The visual and narrative of the travel brochure is the point. I suppose a particularly egregious example of the literal rather than figurative commodification of foreigners is slavery, but there are plenty of others to choose from. A weird one is the fact, mummies were ground up and used to make a particular shade of paint in Europe. We still have no idea how much cultural and historical information was destroyed. For those who are coming from the side of the people being turned into a commodity, this is where the discussion of appropriation comes in. I'm not even going to go down that rabbit hole. It deserves a video all its own. It suffices to say anyone who claims they're being respectful to a culture merely by wearing a hat has a very different definition of the word respect than I do, let alone what anyone from the culture they're mimicking would say. Since this is a narrative and not strictly an action, one needs not travel or stick some feathers to a headdress to engage with race tourism. This is director Eli Roth. In 2013, Roth made a movie called The Green Inferno, itself a tribute to Cannibal Holocaust, a film about a crew of documentarians who exploit a tropical tribe who then take revenge on them. Only Roth decided to put a twist on it and make it social activists who get killed because they underestimated the brutality and viciousness of the tribe they were trying to advocate. Roth was very proud of making sure all of the publicity material discussed how he'd used an uncontacted tribe to star in his movie, so the film was as accurate as possible. Roth told Gawker in 2014, "If you don't like my film, that's fine, but everything in that film is based on real research and how natives live, dress, paint themselves, defend themselves." Apparently, though, the tribe he researched isn't actually the tribe he filmed, so there's no actual proof of the tribe he's talking about, but never mind, the tribe he says exists definitely exists. Just ask him. Interestingly, though, the Kayonako are quite the media-savvy group, what with having successfully lobbied to have their tribal lands set aside as a nature preserve by the Peruvian government to the point that they're currently considered a semi-autonomous region. Hey, did I mention they know what the internet is? See, they thought Roth was filming a comedy. Imagine their surprise. Here's a guy posting with their hashtag on Instagram. And they happen to be part of the long list of tribes who've been pushing back against developmental encroachment into their territory by logging companies and oil drilling, by posting pics and videos to various protest websites. Either Roth thinks uncontacted means they don't have their own merch account on Etsy, or this guy's a bullshit artist who's capitalizing on their foreignness to the target audience and hoping you, like him, choose not to notice the chief has a CP antenna sticking out of his roof. Yeah, these kids really think their souls are getting stolen by the flashy light box, Eli. I'll just skip the part where I notice Roth says his movie is about how vain political activists are, while making a multi-million-dollar Hollywood movie and appearing like this in the production material. From conception to marketing to release, the entire premise of this film is come watch the non-white people be savage at you for an hour and a half. Unsurprisingly, Roth did not donate the proceeds of his film to the tribe's legal funds against the loggers. A good way to stop commodification of color from happening would be stop making those people abnormal, to abolish whiteness as a financially incentivized category. What's truly odd about that is the number of people who are within the white descriptor who push back, since ultimately they're the ones being manipulated. Sure, the brown bodies are being used as a marketing tool, and that's not fun, but the white audience is the one being teased about how boring they are. One would think a white person would find such an accusation more than a little insulting and devious, and yet most seem to revel in the idea they're tedious, transparent culture clones whose entire lives could be summarized as who dies with the most Fortnite emotes and obscure session albums wins.
I found my James Brown record filed under the J's instead of the B's. I don't know who taught you to alphabetize, but to top it off, he's in the rock and roll section instead of the R&B section. How can you do that?
As I said, when European social science first started getting off the ground, they tried to use a very biological model for why it was cultures were different across time and space, so they could rank them on a hierarchy of evolution. Basically, there was this idea that the reason people would live in mud huts was because they were literally physically more primitive. It took longer than one might hope for researchers to point out that's an untestable hypothesis. There is no singular technology one can point to as civilization. The Inuit have sunglasses, which they stylize, and provide a quite modern look. It took the West until the 1980s to catch up, several thousand years later, so you can't use fashion. The first steam engine was developed by an ancient Greek named Hero, who used it as a toy, and they thought lightning was Zeus having a killer orgasm or something, so they're out. The Caribbean tribes didn't have much use for wheels, that's true, but it's mostly because they were too busy using dugout canoes to create a trade network spanning the Americas 4,000 years ago. For those unfamiliar with watercraft, wheels aren't terribly terribly useful. Can't use the wheel, can't use steam, can't even use sunglasses. Oh no, this model is crap, but there have always been holdouts. Why let a bad idea die without a fight? One particularly famous text is called The Bell Curve. It was written in 1994. It was republished a few times with addendums complaining about how its critics in the biological and genetic sciences were wrong because the authors say so, darn it. For a practically chapter-by-chapter deep dive of its wrongness, I highly suggest Sean's 2-hour 39-minute epic, The Bell Curve. But if you're not feeling a craving for his dulcet tones right now about a single book, I can summarize here. Essentially, what it tries to argue is there are IQ differences between the various races. Remember when I asked earlier how one tests an entire continent? They didn't. They just took samples and then guesstimated the rest. Really, all this map proves is the somewhat famous quip from experimental psychologist and historian E.G. Boring: a high score on an IQ test is proof of being able to score well on an IQ test. Maybe you already noticed, depending on which study they're quoting, they can't seem to decide whether there's 3 races, 5 races, 8 races. Though Jews in Europe are 3 separate races, in the US they magically congeal into a singlet. Oh, and at least 2 of the scholars that they quoted in the book felt that the best metric for determining racial IQ was penis size. Still not making this up. Again, with the incels using their kinks to perpetuate race science, I swear to None of which matters much, because ultimately the book is arguing poor people are somehow inferior, so social welfare programs are a denial of Darwin. The Bell Curve as a text demonstrates the authors didn't know and couldn't be bothered to learn the difference between social capital and genetic fitness, and depends on its readers never finding out. An undergrad with access to nothing but Wikipedia would have done a better job. But it confirmed the bigoted preconceptions of its audience, so now every discussion of race and anthropology has to mention it. Murray and Herrnstein are to sociology what snake oil salesmen were to medicine. No more, no less. Linguists like Sapir and Worf tried to explain primitivism through language limitations, which is why we still have myths like the Inuit having 100 words for snow, or the Kalinago having no word for property. Neither of those is true, by the way. The Inuit have prefixes and suffixes that modify the snow that they're describing, so they only have a few words for snow. They just have several different ways to tell you where it is. It's actually English that has a ridiculous number of words for snow. They even sound related: snow, sleet, slush, slurry, flurry, and of course the various descriptives: crunchy, powder, crystal, flaky, blanketing, drifting, falling, packed, heavy, wet. Why does this nonsense story of the Inuit vocab persist? Because of this racial myth that language can somehow tell how limited their minds are. Primitive people can only talk about things they experience. Civilized people talk about ideas. Those wacky Arctics are surrounded by blizzards and build igloos. Of course they must have 1 billion words for snow. Just makes good sense and whatnot. Get me my bush. And for more on just how bigoted the idea of indigenous people having no word for property is, feel free to check out a Brit named William Penn describing, in the 1600s, the maddeningly slow process of negotiating land rights with an entire elders' council. For a people who had no concept of property, they somehow knew how to haggle over the price of things they didn't comprehend. Most social scientists with an ethical bone in their body instead started focusing on how it is different groups of people unify and differentiate between one another within their groups. Weird these sorts of critiques started entering particularly US social science discourse right around the same time minority scholars like black ethnologist Zora Neale Hurston were getting widespread acclaim. Can't think why that would be a factor. It's also why we care about the difference between prejudices and discrimination. Having a prejudice is mostly a mental exercise. Discrimination is enacting a prejudice. Bigotry is discrimination squared. It's assuming a random characteristic is inborn to a group. Importantly, bigots tend to not accept correction. If they think natives are stupid and they meet a native who isn't, it can't be because they were wrong, it's because we got help. Europeans who talk about civilizing the tribes, those are bigots. One form both bigotry and discrimination can take is racism. That's not the only form of discrimination and bigotry. One can discriminate against certain classes of people, a gender, or an age group. By the way, part of deviance intersecting with biological biological modeling is what we call medicalization. Obesity is a big one, excuse the pun. There is not a single consistent definition of obesity anywhere on Earth. So much so, even the so-called medical experts can't seem to get a handle on their definition of fat. Again, randos on Twitter will get into long-winded and meaningless rambles about the body mass index, and I could probably give the entire history of the Belgian astronomer and proto-eugenicist named Lambert Adolphe Jacques Quetelet and his sample size of 50 white guys in 1800, or the fact Quetelet himself said the BMI is basically a math trick, but instead I'll give one simple chart. Did you notice that little note at the bottom? The numbers are different for Asia. What does that even mean? People who live in Asia? People who are genetically from Asian populations? Does that include Russia? So now let's pretend I've got a cancer specialist who refuses to treat me because I'm a full 1.5 points into medically underweight, and this jerk-off has decided that I need to get my weight up, otherwise the treatment will turn my hair blue or whatever. But haha, I've outwitted you again, Moriarty. I explain, I'm 1/2 ethnically Chinese, and he has no idea what that means, but his chart says I get a 1-point penalty, so I quickly run to third base, and now the player to my right gets a mulligan, and that, kids, is how I took our team to victory over Canada in '98. We've placed a scientific and medical veneer of respectability over bigotry, and don't get me started on the heady days when they were still trying to find the gay gene and only checked white people. Or the supposed psychological disorder drapetomania. It's a mental illness, identified in 1851 by Samuel Cartwright as common to enslaved Africans. See, slaves who try to escape are clinically insane because science. He also created the supposed diagnostic dysesthesia aethiopica. He said it was like a white person half asleep. One of the symptoms that he claimed demonstrated his conclusions was blacks having a reduced sensitivity in their skin. He was saying it to claim beating a slave was basically the equivalent of spanking a child, except it's still held as a medical fact today. As a result, and with a staggering lack of humility even for doctors, some have argued this raging ignorance and outright bigotry is a good thing because it meant they'd protected blacks from their inclusion in the opioid crisis by misdiagnosing black patients. Just imagine the level of conceit necessary to say, sure, our med students still believe racist ideas that were outdated before the Model T, but blacks should be grateful we didn't help their debilitating pain sufferers because some people might have overdosed. Although oddly, those same doctors had absolutely no compunction to be so protective of the native population, practically saturating native lands with painkillers, creating waves of addiction, and suppressing the symptoms of chronic disorders. One of the key diagnostic protocols for literally dozens of chronic conditions, including multiple sclerosis and rheumatoid arthritis, is chronic pain. Chronic disorders are regularly underdiagnosed in native population. One wonders if those same doctors are the ones who trained Red Cross Uganda, who dispatched observers doing an experiment where patients suffering from malaria were fed chemical bleach as a treatment, uncovered by YouTuber Miles Powers, that led to Red Cross International disavowing the experiment entirely and 3 men being arrested for attempted poisoning. That Alexander Kang and Barbieri study was revealing for another reason. They basically used Dr. Bell's methodology to identify this information. Medicine is not unbiased. That's not an anecdote. The brown skin was hiding in the stats the whole time. This is what holds a candle to the lie that critical theory is simply identity politics run away with itself. Some first world answer looking for a problem. Poisoning and torturing brown bodies because doctors literally believe their brains are too unintelligent to feel pain is not simply petulant id-pol divisiveness, which is what leads us to the idea of essentialization, where any arbitrary characteristic becomes the fundamental descriptor. This gets very quickly into making it a biological characteristic. There are plenty of individuals out there, like Sam Harris and Bill Maher, for example, who are trying to make the argument, depending on what language you speak, what turban you wear, and religion you practice, your brain is biologically at odds with the good human and needs fixin'. Note the highlighted section, Iron Age Madness. It's a pretty telling phrase coming from a man who has a PhD in neuroscience from UCLA. I've checked my Diagnostic and Statistical Manual version 5 with updated indices, and Iron Ageophrenia appears nowhere in it. I even checked the Latin and Greek cognates from Ferrotempus amentia and Sideroonamania. Bupkis both ways. Of course, I'm sure I'll get letters about how he was being hyperbolic. Well, then he probably shouldn't have said, with regard to Islam, there's no less at stake than the future of civilization. One wonders what Sam might think of quadrupedomania. Plus, it's an even odder claim since in an email exchange to Glenn Greenwald that Harris posted on his own blog, he again references psychological damage and disorder by calling familial Muslims brainwashed. Brainwashed with Iron Age mania, no doubt. Which part of this is the hyperbole? Nice of him to throw in a "some of my best friends are brown" there at the end and then lampshade that he's doing it, though. It's a bit like that old joke about the Jewish definition of chutzpah is a kid who murders his parents and then throws himself on the mercy of the court because life's hard out there for an orphan. Maybe you agree that religion is not but the opiate of the masses. Fine. But the difference here is discussing it as a method of social pressure versus a neurological disorder that identifies a breed of human uniquely primitive as defined by a timeline of cultural mental progress. Critical race identifies the key phrase here isn't brainwashed, it's Iron Age. Even if we presume he's only referring to Islamic extremists, it's still a really odd and specific descriptor to say about a group of people who have their own websites in up to 5 languages. Whose Iron Age included the internet, Sam? Bigots believe brown people aren't naturally smart, they need to be repaired. Sam Harris, Jordan Peterson, Jared Diamond, the bell curve, it's all just Blumenbach 2.0. No more and no less. That's a biological argument and it's essentializing a characteristic in order to medicalize what they consider deviance as an instrument of exclusion. One of the best examples in our world today is the Académie Française, or the French Academy. The Academy has been around for several centuries now. It's a 40-person panel that literally decides whether or not certain words are allowed to be considered true to the French language. It helps to determine educational curriculum, for example. Except their dictionaries are regularly up to 50 years out of date, and the news out of France is rich with cantankerous letters to the editor about the decline of the French language every time so much as an apostrophe gets moved or an accent mark gets eliminated for redundancy. Of course, in the US, that's the height of absurdity, right? Except English got precisely the same treatment. I have an example here of what's called Carolingian minuscule. That way of writing English was developed in the 1100s, when English didn't sound anything like it does today. This is a writing style first developed when Beowulf was still the new kid on the block. As the French Academy article points out, one of the things that's true of instrumentalized writing styles is they start to eliminate letters they didn't think were necessary anymore, which also handily excludes anyone who thinks and writes the wrong way. Ever see those hokey signs that say "ye old corner shop"? That Y is actually part of a pair of letters, eth and thorn, that no longer exist. Ye isn't ye, it's thorn plus E, thee. We don't write like that anymore because someone decided we don't write like that anymore, but ought is just fine. Hey, unconnected fact, the first Chinese text ever acquired by the Bodleian Library at Oxford University was in 1603, but the first fluent Chinese scholar wasn't at Oxford until the 1800s. For 200 years, the Bodleian had a book nobody could read, and it didn't seem to bother them. But I'm sure they indexed it correctly anyway. Just file it under F for foreign, right? Wonder why that would pop into my head right after discussing a group of people who've been dead for 1,000 years being the final authority on how I'm allowed to spell my own tribal name. Look at this. Note the claim in the first section. Oxford has the oldest collection of Chinese texts, including China, only for the post to then admit the copy they have is a rough draft that would never have been put on the market in China. So China had bookstores, but not libraries. Incidentally, that's gibberish. The oldest modern library in China is Chanyi at the Zhejiang province, and it was founded in 1561. So this is wrong like 5 different ways. But why let a little thing like facts get in the way of? So we've got all our jargon and theory ready to go. Phenotypes, deviance, racialization, essentialization, commodification, erasure, and counternarrative. Now I'll toss them all at the wall and see what sticks. With the tools and the methods, we can get to where CRT actually lives, the analysis itself. I want to say before I get into this section, I am not affirming this is the only way to perform a critical analysis, or even that mine is the best one. These are examples to show how CRT reveals relationships between pieces of information that might not be apparent to a casual observer. I'll start with a really easy one. Sinks are racist as hell. Don't believe me? Let me show you something.
Nice. Okay, Noel, you try now. One to your hand. 2 black or? 2 black. Yeah. So what I'll come do again. Come again, Sashi. No. You 2 black over with. What I can do to get what you have to do to see how racial this thing is. Yeah. I have to use that piece of white. Let's say napkin and show it. What's the difference? Bring up again. Napkin again. Right, put your hand out. What's the color in your hand? Man, black man getting fight them all over, boy. All over.
That was from 2017. Or how about this?
But as soon as my blackness enters the frame, which I will sneak into the frame. I'm sneaking in. I'm in there.
That's it. It's
and
over.
There we go. It stopped. My hands are here. Wanda, please get back in the frame. Get back in. As soon as white Wanda appears, the camera moves. Black Desi gets in there. Oh, nope. No face recognition anymore, buddy.
This has been a known and repeated problem for decades in digital recognition. The Atlantic reported on it happening with Asian faces too, through Nikon cameras in 2010. Automatic soap, automatic syncs, facial recognition software. It's designed using data sets that originated with a Hollywood that was racist and photography white balanced to favor pale faces. Browsehound High did a really nice breakdown in his video, Bisexual Lighting, The Rise of Pink, Purple, and Blue. Might not seem like much, but increasingly pulse oximeters, both for home and hospital, use lights shined through fingers to get their reading. It can do this because oxygenated and deoxygenated blood have different reflective wavelengths. Light passes through the finger, and by calculating the degree of reflection, it can figure out your oxygen level and with some clever timing detect whether your blood is moving or not and reveal your pulse. Notice a theme in these pictures? In other words, it works on a modified form of how the soap dispenser sees a hand. Isn't it interesting health disparities between racial groups are wildly disproportionate to their overall populations? Facial recognition is increasingly being used in crime prevention, but I'm sure that won't be a problem. The non-white population in tech is kinda laughable, as this IFL Science points out specifically. Google readily admits this in their corporate filings. And we end up with soap dispensers that can't see Africans, while simultaneously empowering white doctors to claim Black and Latinx patients are faking their conditions to get painkillers. One of the primary physiological indicators of heightened pain reaction is increased pulse. The dull hum of systemic racism marches on. See, I said the first one was easy. But before leaving this example, I would like to add a final cherry. On the face, this seems like the perfect case to advocate for affirmative action in some form. A hiring quota would fix the disparities after all, except it wouldn't fix the fact that apparently their entire sample set for their beta test consisted of one guy named Chadwick Chaddington III, whose closest contact with direct sunlight was motivational posters. The problem is systemic. The next one's a bit harder. Another tool is critique of liberalism. What that really means is an interrogation of arguments which treat all minorities as interchangeable for the purposes of discussion and analysis. If the liberal ideal is a colorblind society, then analysis of any minority is a discussion of all minorities, which doesn't work. As a side note, and this is just for me personally, I do love telling my more Marxist-leaning friends when they get all haughty about their class reductionism that they're behaving like a liberal and just watch them completely lose it. We all find our fun somewhere. Surprisingly, even really lefty and left-adjacent YouTubers like Lindsay Ellis, PhilosophyTube, ContraPoints haven't touched on this aspect of media representation. While they'll note with varying degrees of frustration the absence of minority representation and bias in general media, and even break down the dominant tropes and cliches, there isn't much explanation of which minority has been excluded and what the utility might serve. In other words, it's not hard to notice women in men's armor is differently sexualized in Skyrim, or for some reason all the Transformers are boys, but that's right in front of you. It's rare indeed for anyone to ask where are all the Navajo code talkers in Call of Duty World War II. There were over 10,000 Caribbean enlisted who fought for the British. Puerto Rico contributed on the US side, and the now US territory of Guam literally had a front row seat. Where are they? In the 1936 Berlin Olympics, 18 black athletes went as part of the US team. Altogether, they accounted for a quarter of the medals won by the US that year. It is literally impossible to say blacks and natives didn't directly contribute to the war and the fight against the Nazis. I've even seen a few Holocaust deniers celebrate the blacks winning the Olympic medals as evidence of Hitler's anti-racism. I will reserve my rant on how disgusting it is to think awarding a gold medal to a black man is proof of Hitler's largesse, to instead make the point it does serve to demonstrate how these symbols have real-world political and social consequences. The Windrush fiasco is a prime example. Following World War II and England getting bombed into a pile of rubble, example, the empire tapped its territories for people to come around and help. A lot of those who came were from Caribbean islands like Jamaica. They were collectively referred to as the Windrush generation. Suddenly, a few years ago, England decided that never happened and they declared the Windrush migrants illegal. Oh, and they got to give up all of their pensions and property as they left since they'd obtained it all illegally, what with being illegal immigrants. People who'd literally rebuilt England were being told they never existed.
The reaction to Africans and Asians coming here post-World War II, to rebuild the country after the Queen's German cousins bombed it, the reaction to them was one of general hatred. It's illogical. These people who had formerly been colonized by Britain had fought in both world wars. India gave 2.5 million volunteers, for those who don't know. When we talk about being saved by America in the war, we want to talk about being saved by India and Russia. That would be a bit more accurate. I suppose what I'm saying is not about saying that there's bias and bigotry everywhere in the world. The country my grandparents come from, it's pretty much generally accepted that they don't like gay people. But what's interesting, race even plays a role in that. In Jamaica, we have disgraceful homophobia. No one ever says it's because of Christian fundamentalism. Because even though it is justified in explicitly Christian fundamentalist terms, because only Muslims do bad stuff because of their religion. Because we know almost all the Muslims in the world are brown. Whereas when a German wings pilot crashes and kills 150 people deliberately, or the man in Norway killed nearly 90 people. I was in Australia when that happened. This is how uniform the agreement is that white people will be portrayed differently. The Australian media referred to Andres Breivik as having terrorist-like tactics.
Yeah.
I mean, just think about that. Yeah. This guy killed almost 100 people, and he's just almost a terrorist. Just the European idea. It's an idea that has had insidious implications, because no matter what, the 700 people that were left to drown off the coast of the Mediterranean, were they white human beings, they wouldn't have been left to drown. And they certainly wouldn't be called cockroaches.
The absence of the Caribbean in Call of Duty matters. In fact, the Caribbean has pretty regularly been a location for manipulation by larger economies. Haiti's economy has been a crater for centuries, specifically because when they declared independence from France, the French government charged them for theft, an economic cruelty agreed to by all the major European powers and the United States for a couple of centuries. So racist European scholars like Jared Diamond could come along and make whole careers off of claiming Caribbean people are culturally and possibly even genetically inferior to whites. Remember the bell curve from earlier? Yeah, about that. The US does precisely the same thing. Remember Cambridge Analytica, the company that turned out to be illegally data mining Facebook and Twitter with jokey personality surveys? They then hacked friends lists of everyone who took them. The company was partially owned by US hedge fund manager Robert Mercer and was eventually shut down after it was uncovered they'd engaged in a deliberate disinformation campaign to help Donald Trump. Here's the thing, the template that Cambridge Analytica used was developed in part through experiments all over the Caribbean, including St. Lucia, St. Kitts and Nevis, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and Trinidad and Tobago. Delightfully, their work in Trinidad and Tobago, specifically, was designed to both sway an election and establish a police database to monitor citizens for suspicious behavior. I wonder if they worked with HP and Nikon. Did I mention that Trini's party has been a member of the Christian Democrat Organization of America since 1993? Because they totally have been. Fake protests pretending to be originating from real social unrest, behavior monitoring, Christian political unity, and disinformation campaigns utilizing social media. All of this should start sounding familiar. Interestingly, the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service opened an investigation into this claim, a decade after the alleged program happened. Apparently after someone in the TTPS read the book of Cambridge Analytica whistleblower Christopher Wiley. They then closed the investigation 6 months later after they couldn't get a hold of him through WhatsApp. Clearly, the government was very serious about getting to the bottom of the government using data mining to elect the government. But I suppose at least the TTPS did anything at all. The US government's discovery of a US company manipulating elections and endangering international relations was to fine Facebook and arrest no one, because the Caribbean doesn't matter. My point, and I do have one, is hopefully I've demonstrated a key part of the meaning behind critique of liberalism. Colorblindness does hide data. With that in mind, probably one of the more popular discussions I've seen from larger following critical and lefty YouTubers engaging with not only racism generally, but the types of racism and how they're presented specifically, was Lindsay Ellis's discussion Bright, the Apotheosis of Lazy World Building, a video with over 2 million views as I record this, which is why I will focus my critique of liberalism on that text. Fairly early in the video, she points out how orcs are used rather than actual minorities in the show Bright. She then focuses on a particular scene where Rodriguez, a Hispano-Latino, vaguely browno character, says in reply to an orc,
"Everywhere I go, white orcs always gotta be the bad guys."
Hey, don't look at me, man. Mexicans still get shit for the fucking Alamo.
Ellis is entirely justified in noticing this line had to be written by a white guy with no experience of regular systemic racism, if the most noticeable incident they can personally imagine would be someone yelling "Remember the Alamo" at a Chipotle. She very clearly and correctly assesses Rodriguez is meant to spotlight how Bright is an intentional allegory of real-world racism and bigotry. Simultaneously, she completely misses the fact that there are no primary characters who are Asian in any meaningful way, except Ching, the corrupt sergeant. Some avid fans might point to Qian, as she's played by Veronica Ngo, but Qian isn't human. Why does that matter? Well, this is despite the fact that she has a long discussion just before that point of how Tolkien was fairly racist, and he literally described the orcs as based on the, as he stated, least lovely Mongol types, which means the basic design of orcs right up to the present day is based on the European definition of Asiatic faces. She points this out. Now, importantly, she also notices this means the orcs are then being oddly recast in the movie, lazily, as black with their gangbanger attire and behavior, but she doesn't tie those two facts together. Instead, she draws comparison to the film Alien Nation, which used alien cops as a stand-in for black and Latinx immigrants. Well, okay, but since Alien Nation performed precisely the same sort of Asian deletion, and since aliens are not orcs, we're still talking about the same thing. You were so close, Lindsay. In the trades, we call this symbolic erasure, where the symbol of a group, rather than being tokenized, isn't present at all. A more simplified example of everyday symbolic erasure is, quick, name the black character on the show Friends, a show set in New York City, a city which is 25% black and Caribbean. Hell, Seinfeld was more inclusive, and one of their most racially diverse episodes was when Kramer accidentally set fire to a Puerto Rican flag. If Friends is about normal people, then normal people aren't black or Puerto Rican. This erasure of East Asians from her direct analysis matters because some of the most sweeping anti-immigration laws in the U.S. were the Page Act of 1875 and the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. Their target would seem self-evident. Using aliens and orcs to stand in for migrants, but only discussing migrants in terms of black and Latinx is literally erasing history. While we're here, she also notices Alien Nation shares a lineage with District 9, which was itself an allegory for blacks in South Africa being disenfranchised by the Afrikaner Dutch descendants. Here's the thing. District 9 got a very much deserved criticism for implying blacks were somehow immigrants to South Africa, and then replacing them with insectoids from another planet, which more accurately would be the Dutch in this scenario. While the few Africans who are in the movie are superstitious, drugged gang leaders trying to eat the insectoids to steal their strength. This was so self-evident, even authors attempting to defend the film's portrayal could only manage to say it made the indigenous look bad, but it made the Dutch look worse. I believe they call that damning with faint praise. Bright, conversely, posits the orcs and fairies have been around the whole time, sharing in Earth's real-world history. So where Ellis is contrasting Alien Nation and District 9 against Bright, and already erasing some immigrants from the analysis, she's still making it about immigrants, which the movie isn't about. Ellis makes a point of calling attention to how orcs being a reality for thousands of years should probably require more world building than the occasional tangential reference. I'd ask a further question. Does that mean there's an indigenous orc population of the Americas that was also forced onto reservations? Well, the art designers sure seem to think so, and they went with the single most cliche native pride cheap tattoo parlor rehash of an indigenous graffiti headdress that they could find. All that's missing is a dream catcher with a wolf's head. So why isn't there a single native? I'm not asking for Avatar here, but come on now. Even J.K. Rowling, who is more trouble than she's worth to even mention, managed to put natives in her bizarre Harry Potter Does New England series, History of Magic in North America, and it was a dumpster fire of racism on the back of an exploding train of racism going over a cliff of racism. Trans women are women. J.K. is trash. BT dubs, as precedent, Ellis also cites Buffy the Vampire Slayer and American Gods, both of which involve natives as a key component. Other analogies were available. These aren't tiny little nonsense issues. They're integral to the critique, but somehow they aren't present at all. This is even more noteworthy to me personally because Ellis put it to Twitter to ask how common this Alamo thing is before she ever made the video. In the myriad discussions that followed, several of us brought up how not only is the Alamo not a common go-to racist topic, talking point, but the presumption the Alamo exists in a world coordinate with a native population rewrites most of US history. I'm not suggesting Lindsay should have to read every single response tweet she gets. I'm saying this was not an irrelevant detail in an overall discussion. It's also a history Ellis herself is well aware of, and the two are intimately related, and she's mocked others in the past for being oblivious to it. So why isn't it here? Symbolic Annihilation at its best. A critique of a film about systemic racism, which is perpetuating the systemic racism the film is engaging in, while claiming that it's critiquing the racism. It lets Bright off the hook. Bright wins by setting the parameters of the argument. Bright ignored natives and Asians, so everybody else did too. A critical race theorist would say, instead, Bright wasn't bad because its understanding of racism was hand-fisted and so poorly executed its imagery is from a cheap tattoo parlor. It was all of those things, but much more importantly, it was bad because the film was racist. Bright celebrates its own racism and then claims it isn't doing what it's doing. It's race supremacist propaganda where those with the most in common with Rodriguez aren't human. Where have I heard that before? An analysis like this identifies how easy it is to simply ignore entire populations when they've already been ignored and perpetuate their invisibility as a result. This is what it would look like to perform a critical race analysis of a work. In essence, she has unintentionally categorized Black and Latinx as migrant, regardless of whether some of those Latinx are indigenous, ignored Asians, and left natives to not exist at all. She made choices which she knew would make some sort of sense to her audience. Those choices, those categories, and the different ways those categories are treated in the final product as a result are not logical and they are not statistical. They are racial and they support a particular narrative. To be blunt, Lindsay kinda pulled a racism here. I am extremely doubtful she did so intentionally, but CRT doesn't interrogate morality. All it needs is actions and outcomes and the underlying narrative. Now for a hard one. YouTuber Bad Empanada did a great video on how colonialist rhetoric permeates so much current discourse on seemingly universally agreed upon political and social issues, it can end up empowering horrible people who do terrible things. His example was how Europeans discussing climate change and the forest fires in Brazil regularly exclude any leaders or representatives from the global south, enabling terrible leaders like President Bolsonaro from those excluded nations able to claim they're being victimized by neo-colonialist policies and being right about it, giving those same terrible leaders cultural capital to spend on enacting cruel policies in their own regions under the guise of protection from the global elite, which meshed nicely with several articles and videos out recently regarding the erasure of indigenous knowledge about forest ecology contributing to the most recent climate fires. His point hit me particularly hard, as just after finishing his video, I watched Dan Olson's, aka Folding Ideas' fantastic video on the Flat Earthers turning out to be, in fact, one facet of an entire group of apocalypse-seeking anti-progressive doomsday cultists. His video was thorough and fantastic, and you should all go watch it if you haven't already. He even points out how the fact compasses simultaneously point north and south, but we almost universally speak in terms of magnetic north, means we bias ignoring the south even in map making and reading. Which is why I was so disappointed. As a key example to make his point, he claims flat earthers are syncretistic, and he summarized that by saying syncretistic belief systems completely scrap nuance or implicit meaning and cherry pick one belief to serve as a linchpin for validation. Like someone saying two entirely unconnected mythologies have some version of a flying serpent, therefore dragons exist. Except that's not what syncretism is. Voodoo is syncretistic. Christianity is syncretistic. It's a new series of beliefs based on the underlying ideas of a previous set of ideas, and importantly, it's performed by the practitioners of those beliefs. Jesus was a Jew, and he spoke in explicitly Jewish terms about the nature of God and being a virtuous person, surrounded by Jews. Voodoo practitioners were enslaved peoples carrying their religions from regions like Dahomey to the Caribbean and finding compatible ritual and belief among the indigenous populations. Syncretism is a cultural synthesis. Science is syncretistic. It was European theological scholars who claimed syncretism destroyed the purity of their true Christianity. It was the racists who said syncretism is bad. By claiming flat earthers are merely syncretistic, grasping at otherwise unrelated narratives to falsely validate their otherwise unprovable assertions, what Dan has essentially done is belittle those same cultures he'd only minutes before reminded his audience are often marginalized. Dan has relegated Buddhism and bilingualism to fake culture. Flat earthers, two cultures sharing their identities, is not the equivalent of a white guy on YouTube claiming the pillars of Islam are the same thing as the Viking world tree, which proves the Ring of Sauron is a metaphor for Jewish bankers controlling the world's silver supply.
This is where we run into some dangerous ground, involving things like the Ark of the Covenant, the Holy Grail, and the Ring of Power.
Otherwise, his explanation means there must be real cultures who don't do syncretism, which would mean real culture is keeping the true people pure. Given the scorn he heaps on white nationalists, not only in this video but several others, I don't think that was his intent. Again, CRT doesn't require intent. And just in case I wasn't clear, I'm subbed to both Folding Ideas and Lindsay Ellis. I use them as an illustration of how incredibly deep this kind of cultural exclusion and editorializing can go. In fact, we already have a word for what Dan's describing. We call them liars. They're cultural appropriators, stealing the credibility of lived experience to boost their clout. They're culture tourists. The way I know this is I come from one of the cultures whose collective narratives have been pillaged to justify the dragons that he uses as an example. Wise serpent stories exist all throughout the Caribbean and the Americas. I discussed several of them in my video on Plain Sign, except they're nothing like European medieval period dragons, which is why I don't call them that. Yet those stories are constantly retconned into somehow proving dragon stories are a worldwide phenomena. Of course, it would be more accurate to say reptile stories are a worldwide phenomena, but that doesn't sound nearly as mysterious and foreign. Hell, there are still people who claim that the reason Hernan Cortez was able to conquer the Aztecs is because they were so stupid they thought he was the human form of Quetzalcoatl. Seriously, this is a primary school student only a decade ago. It's a particularly baffling claim considering the only reason Cortez got anywhere at all was because of a captive Nahu woman who served as his interpreter, and because the smallpox the Spanish came with ravaged the countryside. Apparently, the natives also thought that was a little weird, considering during the Taino Rebellion of 1511, Diego Salcedo was drowned in a river as revenge for the way the Spanish had treated the people of present-day Puerto Rico. My favorite part of that story is the sheer number of statues now dedicated to memorializing the event throughout the island, but that would be 6 years before Cortez started rampaging through the Yucatan in 1518. A water god who can drown and needs a translator to bring fertility in the form of a plague. Oh wait, who recorded this story again? By the way, Columbus made exactly the same claim, that the Taino and Kalinago worshipped him after he used an eclipse to make the sun disappear. He says he told the locals to pray to him or he wouldn't bring it back. These were people with navigational charts that spanned hundreds of miles, who'd seen eclipses half a dozen times, and who were neighbors to a culture with some of the most precise astronomical calendars in history. Sure, Chris, it had nothing to do with the beheadings and rapes that eventually got so bad he was prosecuted back in Spain for crimes against nature and required a special pardon from the king to get him out of it. That is the synthetic culture Dan's talking about, smashing together stories with no ability to simultaneously exist by ignoring the inherent internal contradictions. We know why the Spanish did it. They created a nonsense story to justify their mindless enslavement and slaughter of whole swaths of the indigenous population. Thing is, though, their made-up histories perpetuated. One of the explanations they used to claim conquering the Caribbean was a good thing was claiming everywhere they went were cannibals. That's how the Caribbean gets its name. It's from Spanish for meat, carne. Carnibal is literally where we get the English word cannibal. We've been calling it land of cannibals for 500 years. The term was so entwined with the history, they even named a tribe for it, the Carib. Some members of that tribe have since petitioned the various governments of the islands to change their names specifically to escape the stigma associated with it. The Kalinago of Dominica is a good example. Dan is using the conquistadors' vocabulary to nullify the lived experience of hundreds of cultures and doing so without even noticing. Syncretism isn't fake culture. Lies are fake culture. I want to be clear, I'm not calling any of the examples I've cited intentionally bigoted. Neither Dan or Lindsay is mere inches away from donning a clanhood. One of the reasons I specifically focused on critics and theorists who are decidedly left of center in their discussions is all of them are specifically aware of and make a point of spotlighting how rhetoric feeds dominance. Dan acknowledged compass points point south, but we still say they point north. Lindsay has half a dozen videos on critical analysis of film and literature. Thought Slime openly calls out other rhetorical sleight of hand.
I also feel in a weird place where I can't really criticize because in almost any situation I am the colonizer.
That's true.
You know? So it's kind of rich for me to tell you, no, here's how you can protest colonization.
I was so glad to see Dan's appreciation of the colonialist subtext of Minecraft, I included it as part of my discussion on minority gaming. That self-reflection is significant. None of these people is a rube, yet all manage to engage in bigoted discourse. That said, firstly, there's no challenge in identifying racism in overtly racist content. Second, by focusing on individuals who overtly reject those narratives, while simultaneously perpetuating the underlying assumptions and deletions those narratives depend on, I've hopefully proven CRT's assertion at how pervasive these narratives are. Using critical race theory on an overt white nationalist or traditionalist is frankly using a microscope to read the newspaper. Sure, it's possible, but why? You'll just end up wasting a perfectly good microscope. There are whole channels where the presenter times how long before some race realist says a phrase like the Jewish question. Well, great, but I promise there are right-leaning channels doing precisely the same thing with words like privilege. There's no attempt to undercut the narrative being discussed.
To bring the whole thing back on itself like a bulging, veiny Ouroboros, whenever they're tasked with formulating their own beliefs in detail, they invariably end up appealing to things like classical virtue.
If classical liberal and classical values are code, which they definitely are, what's wrong with classical? What is it referencing? Who is it erasing? I too am an adherent of classical values, but my classics have nothing to do with Renaissance Europe or ancient Greece. Force Richard Spencer or Jordan Peterson to defend the swan-shaped rapist that is Zeus whenever he talks about the glory that is Athens, and it just might turn off a few people who were on the fence about them. It may or may not be effective, but screaming Nazi bad into the void isn't counter-narrative, and it certainly isn't decolonized. It's ceding territory that Athens is classical and all others must be measured against them. Fuck Athens. Those wine-swilling, underage prostitute-obsessed pederasts can shut up for a while. Plus, they stole some of their best stuff anyway. And don't get me started on Rome. Similarly, though, CRT is certainly able to identify overt acts of exclusion, such as video games almost universally having white protagonists. That doesn't get at the system underlying the reality. Ellis herself has one of the best explanations of why erasure is important when she discusses why anyone should care all the Transformers in Michael Bay's movies are almost uniformly male. What's being treated as normal eventually becomes default, and when we have to justify including the rest of the planet because now the rest of the planet doesn't conform to the definition of default, we have a problem. What's worth asking is how the default is being justified to begin with, which is also why so many find critical analysis so frustrating. It never ends. They want a point where things are fixed. It's one of the reasons primitive communism in many leftist spaces is incredibly insulting, but also deceptive. It is the pretense of appreciating the indigenous cultures and their histories, while simultaneously belittling them for being an inferior version or even a quaint imitation of the correct path. Well, not for nothing, but the absolute most egregiously inaccurate estimates for the populating of the Americas places them at a time when North American continent alone was covered with woolly mammoths, saber-toothed tigers, buffaloes twice the size they are now, bears which were 2 stories tall standing, and forests so dense with vegetation they were literally unpassable. Out of that, they didn't just merely carve an existence, they founded cultures, trade networks, and traditions which would survive and thrive for literally tens of thousands of years. Caribbean tribes had an international dugout canoe trade network that spanned from the Great Lakes to the Orinoco River Valley when Egypt was still working out how to build pyramids that didn't collapse from their own weight. There's irony to people who need hours of tutorials for how to properly construct a planter box in their temperature-controlled apartments, calling these people primitive. But CRT is pretty clear about how subsurface perpetuation of racist tropes can be every bit as harmful. For example, you ever heard of terra preta? It's a type of self-fertilizing dirt developed by the indigenous population of the Amazon basin. It's one of the ways groups in the area were able to develop large-scale agriculture without damaging the surrounding forest by constantly cutting it down and burning it for more arable land like they did in much of Europe, and what European-style multinational beef and agricultural conglomerates are trying to do to the Brazilian rainforest right now. By the way, terra preta is so good at its job, it literally increases its own volume over time, enabling it to sequester more carbon the longer it remains in place. Biologists aren't sure how it does this. Maybe thinking of indigenous food culture exclusively in terms of seal hunts and buffalo hides is a racist myth invented by Europeans patting themselves on the back at how civilized they were while drinking blood from hanged prisoners to cure epilepsy. Of course, that is when they weren't using mummy bone powder to cure headaches, but as I already mentioned, they were competing with the mummy paint industry. Given Europe's own history with cannibalism, one might presume calling the Carib cannibals was a compliment, except for it being used as a justification for conquest, further proving brown skin was the relevant detail, and it had nothing to do with the lemonade. Maybe Adorno and Horkheimer were onto something, and these Enlightenment incels were just really desperate for someone to finally tie them up and ball gag them already. The age of exploration was nothing but betas in search of a dom. Now that would have been a fantastic clickbait title. Crap, too late now. Bad scholarship helps support bigoted assumptions. In other news, water is wet. Some might validly ask why I have yet to mention Kropotkin's mutual aid at this point. Well, because he uses cannibals as a descriptor 9 separate times. Once going so far as to quote a Christian missionary to Australia named Lumholtz without quoting a single indigenous Australian. He might as well be quoting Columbus. And in a delightful bit of recursion, in another section he points to how Mexican cannibals were born of necessity as demonstrated by their having dug up their dead and eating their bones. Excusing the work by saying his intent was to demonstrate the lessons we should learn from so-called primitive societies is just excusing his racism by saying his heart was in the right place. If mutual aid truly blew your mind, okay, but not only has Europe gotten more than its fair share of the stage time, Fernando de Alva Ixtlilxóchitl's History of the Chichimeca Nation beat him by over 300 years. In fact, Ixtlilxóchitl's magnum opus, himself having been educated in Spanish schools of the period, makes regular reference to how absurd it is Europe derided his people as violent pagan savages, while themselves claiming an unbroken line of civilization from ancient Rome and Greece, cultures so consistently violent they ended up with not one, but a dozen gods of war. Pagan savages indeed. Fuck Greece. Take a look at The Souls of Black Folk, which was published at the same time as Mutual Aid. Learn about double consciousness, the answer to class consciousness, where being part of a racial minority allows one to see the racial dichotomies enacted all around us with a clarity those in the racial hegemony cannot understand. Commodification of color, and he's saying it in 1903. Learn about Sojourner Truth's words, herself making her famous speech the same year the Communist Manifesto was published, but to significantly less historical fanfare. Then move on. Today, most leftists, even if they don't agree on much, do agree that the voices of the underprivileged are massively outmatched by the voices of those plundering them for resources. It really shouldn't come as a screaming shock to those same leftists that historically the same forces were at play in 19th century publishing houses. And yet I see far more people debating the merits of Marx versus Trotsky than I ever see discussions of Du Bois's work on universal education or Susie Walking Bear Yellowtail's accounts of organizing state-sponsored health collectives. That absence is noteworthy. Sure, it's good ally praxis to have a link on a podcast to the O'odham, and it's good praxis to shout out the Wet'suwet'en protests in your Twitch stream, but perhaps it might also be good praxis to actually go to those indigenous populations of a region and get to know how they survived and thrived before settlers got there. After all, the Wet'suwet'ens didn't start getting international attention until they took to Twitter. A bit ironic that these media-savvy natives were then the subject of debates on the left over whether or not their protest was valid because they have a hereditary chieftainship. Not that anyone debating it knew how the system actually worked by, say, speaking with a native.
Vosh, I totally agree with you. Ethnostates are fucking disgusting. I think we should abolish ethnostates wherever they are springing up, and I'm totally on board with you. I will fight to the end of time to join you on that alliance, my brother. There's nothing grosser than an ethnostate, and I think white nationalist ethnostates, they're the baddies. Indigenous people around the world are being oppressed, and they're being oppressed while at the same time they are not fighting necessarily to have their own private ethnostates. They're actually fighting for the preservation of all of us.
A white guy chiding another white guy about a debate between two other white guys, profiling how much brown people can benefit all the white people. And those are videos expressly advocating for the protest. If the responding argument is that white anarchists and socialists and lefties need to hear from other white lefties to finally be convinced to acknowledge native sovereignty, then they're confirming the subtext. The critical race approach is to undercut the narrative. If a militant vegan goes off on natives being unhealthy because all the vegan knows is buffalo hunts and not terra preta, they're perpetuating a narrative. Simply saying, well, that's their opinion. Yeah, counter-narrative is key. One Amazonian tribesman posting the occasional video about forest conservation is worth 100 YouTubers rereading Proudhon for the 20th time, which I suppose is also the call to action sections of this video. I've already mentioned Bad Empanada, Say It Loud, there's also Rare Earth, Reuben Angel, Angry Black Homo, Camazot's Altar, Rude DeLeslin, Jade's work with the Black Deaf videography and filmmaking community, the Indigenous Anarchist Federation, Native Lang, LaRon Reedus, Forever James's, The Storyteller, and I am a huge fan of Conquest of Dread. That is not a comprehensive list. It's not a complete list. It's a list. I've linked them in the down below, but there's plenty of hours worth of footage to work with and tons of other YouTubers out there who deserve the following. I'm also not saying that I agree with every syllable they say, but if anything, that's better for exemplifying how we all have our own take and interests we speak to. Plus, I haven't even mentioned the Philippines, Hawaii, most of Africa. Imagine a globe where borders were based on food traditions or languages, architecture and art, or burial practices. What would those borders look like? Finally come to terms with the fact that these racial designations are not only incorrect, but they are also not simply the thing the other side engages in. Hopefully, I've demonstrated it's both much older and much less controversial than a great number of pundits and op-eds floating around might suggest. So, congratulations! You now know what CRT is, a bit about where it came from, and how it can be applied to the real world. There's an old joke. What do you call a leader with no followers? Just a guy taking a walk. If bread tube's so white, then stop. Dr. Bell may have outwardly spoken, and even titled one of his books, The Permanence of Racism, but he also continued teaching at New York University School of Law until he died. If he truly believed that it was hopeless, his actions betray his optimism. And in making this video, I hope I've also demonstrated mine. With that, I am grateful for all of those who have contributed to my last video. I never expected my previous work to resonate so well, and I am thankful for each and every one of you. Of course, this means I'm gonna have to pay a lot more attention to my Patreon and update it maybe more than once a year, but frankly, it's a good problem to have. If this is your first time seeing my work and you'd like to hear more from me in the future, please subscribe to my channel, or at least click a thumb for the almighty algorithm. As I said, I have links to the various accounts that I mentioned down in the underside, and if there's more information you'd like, please give me a comment and I'll do my best to answer. And now I'd like to give a shout out to all of the wonderful people who have donated to this passion project of mine. I hope that I am able to continue providing you the kind of content that you think is worth your investment. Cannot thank you enough. Dan Pike, Yivhi, Laura Quavito, Star Eye, with a 4 in the middle of it, Kalani Riaz, Lola Isabel, Ghosty Ghoulie, Andy Cow, Athena Rogers, Yves Coley, Aaron07, Anarch Optimist, Kyle Pittman, Jacques Marshall, Zane Cladon, Seasoned Rice, BDS Mayberry, Eric Sheehan, DAF, Alimi, Madi, Jennifer Fronster, Tobias Weber, Justin Brunden, Rainier Behringer, Andrew Wood, Ivy Melinda, Alexander Ross, and Seth. And a particularly huge shout out to Du Kea Han. I'm almost certain that I am not pronouncing that correctly. My apologies. But yeah, you get some extra credit there. I hope that you are well. I hope that you are in a safe and supportive place. And I hope you have fun.